So now we're going to move into the next panel on numbers and politics and how to sort through economic research on immigration and be able to use it in our reporting. We have three speakers this morning. I'm going to introduce one at a time. They will each make a presentation for about 20 minutes. They have slides. There is a logic to the order here. We're going to go from the general on the American economy to the specific on economics of immigration to taking it down to the state level and to many of your local markets. So we're going to open with Harry Holzer, who's a professor of public policy at Georgetown. Like so many people who are involved in this issue, he was a former chief economist of the U.S. Department of Labor. There's a whole, if you look at so many of the immigration economists and the people who debated this, they've all had some stage at labor. And it makes sense if you think about it, because the impact of immigration on wages is crucial to the whole issue here. Harry is very well known for anybody who's done economic policy and economic reporting in Washington. He focuses, his research over the years has focused heavily on employer behavior, on job quality, and on particular groups of low-income workers, which involves a lot of some of the people that we're dealing with. So Harry, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, while Stephanie's bringing up my PowerPoint, I'll just say good morning. I was sorry to miss the dinner last night and sorry I didn't get to meet more of you in advance and miss my friend Dimitri. I know he always puts on a good show. And I was trying to see if I could come in and make it for the dinner. Thank you. But then when an old college roommate of mine called and said he had tickets to the World Series, it was a hard thing to pass up. What I will say is that probably most of you, had a warmer evening than I did, and maybe a little less disappointment at the end. So maybe you all came out ahead in that sense. But I'm very happy to be here, and as Edward said, compared to my two co-panelists, Giovanni Perry and Judith Gans, who are much more directly steeped in this work, I am a bit more of a consumer and synthesizer and thinking about what does all this mean for public policy. So I'm going to give you kind of a broad overview of where I think a lot of the research on immigration has been there. And just try to make some sense of different things people say and maybe how to report it. So, start with what are the different lenses that people use when they talk about immigration? What kinds of things do they think about? Some folks do look at the aggregate economy. Is this good for the U.S. overall? Others focus on demographic subgroups, not only splitting the immigrants from the native-born workers, and as you know, the native-born workers are really the group that get a lot of attention in this discussion, but also separating them by their education levels, and what happens to native-born college graduates as a result of immigration might be really quite different than what happens to native-born high school dropouts, for instance. Sometimes people do focus on locational subgroups by state and region, but all this means that the story is often about redistribution. If immigration is helping some groups much more than others, and may even be hurting some groups of Americans, inevitably you start talking about who gets helped and who gets hurt, and is immigration part of a transfer process, and not just about aggregate effects. In terms of what outcomes people like to talk about, the big one, I think it gets a lot of attention, as well I think it should, is the employment and earnings, especially of the native-born workers for these different skill groups. But there are other outcomes that do matter from an economics point of view. Overall, the level of output in the country, both in terms of the level of output and its rate of growth over time, consumer prices, employer profits, and very importantly, in the world we live in now, what does it do to fiscal balance, both today and going forward? So those are all some of the things I think the research has touched on to try to make some sense of. But as I sort of said, I think the really big issue is what does this do to native-born worker employment, native-born worker earnings? And again, if any of you ever took an economics class, and my guess is that most of you did, and I'm sorry if I'm bringing back painful memories for a lot of you by bringing this stuff up, what it really is talk about this is a big labor supply shift. It's a chunk of additional workers coming to America. What does that do to the overall labor market? Now, I'm going to start with two things that it generally doesn't do. But these two ideas animate a lot of the debates, both in Washington and elsewhere. One from the people that really oppose immigration and one from the people that generally tend to support it. The people who oppose immigration talk as if we have a fixed number of jobs in America. So if 1 million immigrants come in some year, that means 1 million fewer jobs for Americans. And that, of course, generally is wrong. The American economy and the labor market is quite adaptable. New jobs open up in response to new workers, although perhaps at lower wages than they otherwise would have paid. But that's a completely different lens than you hear a lot of the people, a lot of the politicians speaking as if there's a one-for-one job loss for every immigrant that comes over. Now, I'm going to put one caveat on that notion. When you're in a recession economy or a recovery that is as sluggish as the one we have right now, that view is maybe not quite as crazy as it otherwise would be, at least in the short term. You know, when you're in a recession economy or the kind of economy we have, there actually is a sort of a more limited number of jobs relative to workers. And this notion that more people would be competing for them is not completely crazy in the short term. Whether you have a short-term view or a long-term view has an important effect on the lens you put on this stuff. But the other argument you often hear from the immigration proponents is also not quite true. People speak as if, my God, if we don't let all these immigrants in, and God forbid if we have actually a smaller flow from Mexico, we're going to have no workers in America willing to do the work that we need those immigrants to do. No one will be here to pick our fruit. No one will be here to mow our lawns. And that view is also incorrect, right, for a number of reasons. Places do adapt. And you look at parts of America that haven't had immigrant flows, as my friend George Borjas here at Harvard often says, the lawns still are green and the farm it gets picked. There are adjustment processes that economics have. And the number of workers willing to do a kind of work is not fixed. It also responds to the wages offered in that sector. And as the wages go up, sometimes more workers are willing to come in and do that work. Again, to get Americans to go out and pick fruit, it may take a massive rise in wages. And by the time wages got that high, employers would be doing something else, like mechanizing those farms. But again, trying to get people away from this notion that there's a fixed number of jobs or a fixed number of workers willing or unwilling to work in any sector. I think both of those are flawed notions. Then there's one important factor that I think features very prominently in Giovanni's work and many others. The relationship of immigrant workers to native-born workers can take a variety of modes. And we have a notion in economics, again, if you ever took economics, you've heard the difference between complements and substitutes. In the labor market, if two workers are substitutes for each other, they are very similar. They're competing for the same jobs. And the presence of these new immigrants to their native-born substitutes is more likely to be negative. You know, they're going to be competing for the same jobs. They're probably going to drive down wages for those workers. But there are some groups of American workers who are actually complements rather than substitutes to a lot of these immigrants coming over. So let me give you a couple of quick examples. Native-born American professional women trying to get in the workforce if they have kids at home are helped a great deal by having immigrants who come over and make the child care problem easier. They're complements. The presence of these immigrants actually increases the ability of these women to enter the labor market and to work and to do well. So the presence of immigrants actually helps that group of native-born workers. So let me give you a different example. If a small engineering company can afford to spend less on its custodial staff because of immigrants, A, it might reduce the prices of their products, and B, that will generate more revenues and more employment possibilities for people in all other levels in the company. Again, they're complementary, not substitutes. And so that has a big effect. And what a lot of the economists like Giovanni have done is really trying to figure out exactly who in this labor market are substitutes versus complements for the immigrants coming in. And I think that's an important piece of the story to understand as well. And as I sort of said before, different groups, the immigrants coming in might be more substitutable with the immigrants who are already here than with the native-born workers who are often in different sectors. So all that's important to keep in mind. So as economists approach this stuff, as you probably know, economists almost never agree on anything uniformly. The famous comment of Harry Truman, give me a one-handed economist, because it's always on the one hand or the other hand. There is this broad research literature, and people have tried to figure out what these effects are. Let me try to describe a little bit of what that research is like. What it's usually about is you try to compare high immigrant versus low immigrant geographic locations or broad groups of workers, and then you compare how they're doing in terms of employment or earnings, and you try to control, as best you can, for everything else that might affect those workers, like local unemployment rates and things like that, and try to really get then, therefore, it's like almost like trying to create an experiment between high immigrant locations and low immigrant locations, and then try to see if you can tease out, therefore, the effects on, say, the native-born workers in those areas. Traditionally, what this literature has done, for both data needs and other reasons, it used to focus a lot on different states, geographic states, or metropolitan areas in America. So you compare the high immigrant states versus the low immigrant states and see how the native-born workers are doing in those places or in different metro areas. More recently, and especially here in Cambridge, there's been a group of economists not doing that, focusing more on different demographic groups, like breaking up the US labor force into age by education groups in different years, and then trying to look at years and groups that had a lot of immigrants come in, like less educated young workers since 1980, versus those that didn't have a lot of immigrant competition, more highly educated workers maybe more before 1980, and do that comparison. And you sometimes get different answers depending on which they do. And why is there a debate coming out of this literature? Because sometimes the different methodologies have led to somewhat different answers. And people talk a lot about the statistical biases. And again, if you ever had a statistics class, as opposed to an economics class, you've probably heard about the concept of bias in statistical work. And that means essentially when the analysis is not quite as strong as it would like to be. There's certain things you can't control for, certain times when it's not that Y is causing X, it's really that X is causing Y. And these tend to give you statistical answers that are incorrect in one direction or the other. And it turns out, as with most things in economics, that those two different pots of research tend to have different biases. I think a lot of people came to the conclusion that comparing across geographic areas creates a positive bias on the effects of immigrants, meaning the effects of immigrants look more positive or less negative than they really might be. Let me give you an example of that. Suppose you're comparing the status of native-born workers in LA versus Detroit. I'm taking extreme examples, obviously, to make a point. And those in LA, they have a lot of immigrants. Detroit has relatively few. And yet the native-born workers are doing a lot better in LA than in Detroit for lots of other reasons that we might understand. But people doing that kind of comparison might look, geez, immigration has no negative effect on anybody and maybe even has a slightly positive effect, or not so slightly. But we all understand that's because the analysis doesn't control for certain other things going on in Detroit and LA. And even you can try to control for some of those things, maybe not all of them. So that a group of economists shifted, they say, and another problem with the cross-area study is there's starting to be some evidence, again, always contested how big this is, that when immigrants move into LA, actually the native-born workers start leaving. And they start moving to Seattle or Portland or Phoenix or wherever else they might go. What that means is that if there's a displacement effect or a competition effect associated with the immigrants, you may not see it in the place where the immigrants arrive, right? It may be displaced onto one of those other cities. That's where the competition occurs. So if you're comparing LA to other cities, you're going to miss that. You know, it's really in Portland and Seattle and those other places that you might really feel the effect of the immigration shock into LA. So people started saying, so maybe this cross-geographic thing may not be the best way to go. So economists developed this other way. And again, a guy named George Borjas here at Harvard really kind of spearheaded this analysis of saying, let's look at a more aggregative way. Let's look at these age by education groups at different point in time. Some of them have a lot more immigrants, some have others, and do that. And that analysis, when he did it, did show much more negative effects. But there's biases in George's work too, and the biases probably go in the other direction. If George is showing that young, less educated workers in high immigration years are doing worse, is that really because of the immigrants? Or because other things are going on in the economy that George can't control for? Technology, globalization, weaker unions, lower minimum wages, et cetera. So you can argue that there's biases in one direction from one part of the research, bias in the other direction. I think the two best known protagonists in this area, David Card at Berkeley, George here at Harvard, and lots of other economists and students of those guys that often work with them. Having said all of that, should I take a question now or should I clarify?
Quick question about Borjas. So his studies typically have the same outcome, negative, right?
They tend in that direction.
And so I'm just wondering in terms of like when we look at statistical biases, should we also be looking at the kinds of studies that folks that we're paying attention to who study immigration and its effects on, U.S. life and so on? Should we be looking at, separating, as a way to kind of ferret out when there is clearly a bias?
I think there's a potential bias in every study that gets done. And interestingly, I skipped this line, there are a set of studies that, a lot of studies try to fix for this, and there are ways of trying to reduce the effects of those biases. People argue about whether those effects are successful or not. Some folks look for these so-called natural experiments. Like David Card wrote this very famous analysis. Imagine immigrants can't self-select into high, strong economies. They just got plopped down in an area out of nowhere, there was a famous boat lift coming out of Cuba when Fidel Castro let go of all the prisoners in 1980, and a lot of them just plopped down in the Miami area, creating a natural experiment as a way to study. So all studies have potential biases, and what economists mostly do is argue back and forth, are my biases worse than yours or not? So, and if economists can't quite come against it, it's probably going to be hard for journalists or other folks. I'm just alerting you to the fact that at least potentially those biases exist in a lot of studies. People do make efforts to fix them, to come up with statistical techniques to get around them. Whether those are successful or not remains a subject of some debate. I think it'd be very hard for folks really to sort of sort out. My reading, I think, as I said, the sort of cross-geographic stuff that David's done probably still has some positive bias. Stuff George has probably has some negative bias. Others might disagree with that. That's sort of where I come down on this stuff. But I'm just learning the fact that they exist. Now, having said all of that, you look at this whole literature, and people aren't as far apart as the noise would lead you to believe. I think there is some consensus, and there's bounds on the level of disagreement. So, for instance, I think it's pretty clear that in terms of overall GDP, immigration has a positive effect, and probably on per capita GDP over a long time period. If there's any group of American workers that are clearly negatively affected by immigrants, it's previous generations of immigrants, often coming from the same places. If there's anybody for whom a Guatemalan immigrant is going to be a close substitute for, it's maybe a Guatemalan immigrant who came 10 years earlier, right? And they're often looking for the same kinds of jobs and working in the same sectors. They're the ones in every study take a big negative hit when other people come from their regions and places. But if you're looking at native-born Americans, the results are more mixed, but generally not enormous one way or the other. It seems as though highly educated native-born workers come out ahead, if anything, from immigration. As I gave you the example of the professional women who benefit from the extra child care support. And that seems to encompass a lot of more highly educated native-born Americans. High school graduates, close to zero effects, and maybe high school dropouts, modest negative effects. I think most of the literature, so George Barras will say the negative effect is this big, and other folks, Giovanni or maybe David Card, might say it's really this big, but I think broadly there's some consensus in that. And it raises this interesting question, then why are these effects so small? The number of immigrants who came over from Mexico over a 20, 25-year period added to the number of high school dropouts in the US labor force by 30 to 40%. That's a really big impact on that submarket. Why are the effects so modest if those flows? And I think there's broadly three answers to that question. Number one, immigrants are consumers as well as producers. They have shipped out demand for products in local economies as well as supply, so that demand helps offset at least part of that effect. Number two, they're often not substitutes with a lot of groups of Americans. And I think there's some evidence even from Giovanni's work that if immigrants come into a certain sector, Americans will try to get out of that sector and go elsewhere and maybe try to improve their skills so they're more competitive in those other sectors. And of course, the third thing is that employers, in the face of a big group of immigrants, will change their production processes. If faced with a big group of immigrants, they will do production that's a lot more labor intensive. And if they don't have a big group of immigrants, they'll probably go much more towards mechanization, where it's possible, like in agriculture. You can't mechanize childcare, you can't necessarily mechanize home construction, but in some sectors at least you can move in that direction. So there's ways in which the economy responds that tend to dampen this immigration effect, and in reality make it much smaller than the talking heads on cable television will make you believe. And in the long run, there's an argument that the effect of any big labor shock is zero, or maybe close to zero, simply because in a lot of these long run, all kinds of things adjust. capital flows in when labor flows in, and in the end, they sort of tend to offset each other and not have big effects. There is a redistribution between some groups, but not big effects in the aggregate. Now, that's on native-born workers. There's all these other dimensions that research has always also tried to find some effects on. Innovation, that seems to go up when you have a lot of highly educated immigrants. Also, some greater efficiencies in some markets. Consumer prices get a little smaller, profits get a little bigger. Some people have looked at all this and said, on net, immigration's good for rich Americans and bad for poor Americans. And there's been this argument made, everybody who benefits from immigration is a rich person. You know, they go to the restaurants, the high-end restaurants, and they pay lower prices. They pay less for their child care. Their profits go up. I think that view is overstated. I think there's other sectors that benefit lower-income Americans in terms of the cost of health care, the cost of elder care, the costs of food or housing, that also generate some benefits to low-end Americans as well as high-end. So I think that story is overstated. And then there is an argument about fiscal balance. Having all these immigrants come in, what does it do to the long-run fiscal picture at the state and local level as well as federal, in the short run as well as the long run? I think the long-run effects for the federal government are clearly positive. You know, when the baby boomers are retiring, that's going to put a lot of pressure on federal budgets. It's better to have a growing population of working-age folks, not just the immigrants, but the children and grandchildren of immigrants will do more to help out, although I think at the local level and in the shorter term, the effects might be more mixed. So a lot of questions remain. You know, I think there's been so much energy put on these basic questions of, are the native-born workers helped and hurt? There's all kinds of other dimensions. I'm not going to say there's no research on this area. I think economists are starting to address, but we just have not as good data, not as broadly available data, and not as much time has been spent trying to look at these important other dimensions. The effects of documented versus undocumented workers, the effects of temporary workers versus more permanent ones in different categories, how the status of the American economy affects all this. And most important, if you look at the potential effects of reform, say the Senate bill was somehow going to make it into law, which doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. There's all kinds of questions about if you now take 7 million workers who are undocumented and make most of them documented, how does that change the analysis that we've seen over time? Are the enforcement efforts going to be effective? How are they going to affect the future flows into a lot of sectors? The demographic changes in Mexico, which are going to have a big effect on those flows. How are they going to, on those flows? How are they going to affect the picture? I think we know vastly less about all these issues, and very important to the reform discussion, than we do about the things I talk about. So the good news for that is that it gives economists a lot of work to do, my colleagues and I, and I think, I guess I encourage folks to keep reading that research and to keep trying to ask the questions. And I think it's good to acknowledge where there's some consensus and where there's not, where we have some legitimate answers based on the previous research and where we don't. Economists aren't always so good at being modest about what we know and what we don't know. I think a fair amount of modesty is called for in a lot of these situations, but that's my view of the broader thing, and I look forward to Giovanni and Judith's remarks to get a little closer to the actual work. So thank you very much.